Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Thoreau, and I'm the president of the Independent Institute, which is a privilege that I've had for a number of years. I want to welcome you to our Independent Policy Forum this evening. We're quite delighted this evening to welcome our good friend, the investigative journalist Mollie Hemingway, who will be speaking based on her new #1 best-selling book with Carrie Severino that many of you had the opportunity to get copies of. It's called Justice on Trial, the Kavanaugh Confirmation and the Future of the Supreme Court. For those of you who are new to the Independent Institute, at your seats there was a packet that you're welcome to explore. Independent is a nonprofit public policy research institute. We have about 140 to 150 fellows spread across the country. We produce lots of books and other publications. This is also the current issue of our quarterly journal, The Independent Review, which has a symposium critically looking at the concept of social justice, which I think you'll find of interest. The mission of Independent is to boldly advance peaceful, prosperous, and free societies grounded in a commitment to human worth and dignity. And the results of this work are published as books and other publications and form the basis of numerous conference and media programs like what we're having tonight. We seek and we accept no government funding. Our support comes all from private voluntary sources, including businesses, foundations, civic organizations, and individuals. And we welcome you to join with us as a member. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to point out that in the packets that you have, you also find a flyer on tonight's program, as well as on our Center on Law and Justice, which relates to tonight's topic. There's also an article by Mollie Hemingway and also her co-author Carrie Severino from the Wall Street Journal I think you'll enjoy. And on the reverse side, there's an article that we placed in the San Francisco Chronicle today by Mollie on a very, I think, contentious issue, which I think you'll find relevant to tonight's topic pertaining to the interest in packing the Supreme Court. The announcement in June 2018 by Justice Anthony Kennedy of his retirement set off a media maelstrom, triggering a confirmation process that his successor, Brett Kavanaugh, would denounce 3 months later as a national disgrace and a circus. Nasty politics and unverified accusations of sexual assault became weapons in a ruthless campaign of personal destruction. A key reason is that the Supreme Court has become the arbiter of America's most vexing and divisive disputes, which is not exactly what the founders had in mind. With the stakes of each vacancy incalculably high, has the incentive to destroy a nominee become irresistible and inevitable? Will the next time a nominee promises to change the balance of the court be even uglier? And how will this affect the future of America? In her new book, Mollie Hemingway reveals the true story of what really happened, based on extensive interviews with more than 100 people, including the President of the United States, several Supreme Court justices, high-ranking White House and Department of Justice officials, dozens of senators, and others. Mollie is the senior editor of The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. She's a senior journalism fellow at Hillsdale College and a Fox News Channel contributor. She's a regular panelist on Media Buzz with Howard Kurtz, as well as the Fox News All-Stars on Special Report with Bret Baier. You may have seen her also on Laura Ingram's show, Tucker Carlson's show, and elsewhere. Her work has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, as I mentioned, the piece that's in your packet, USA Today, the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Christianity Today, and elsewhere. She received her degree in economics from the University of Colorado, and she has been a Phillips Foundation Journalism Fellow and a Lincoln Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Mollie Hemingway.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And I would also like to just thank the Independent Institute. My husband and I are both journalists. And as was mentioned, I do a lot of television, and I frequently get nice comments from people about my preparation for these things. And my secret is that I like to read policy papers and books. And there are so many topics that have been covered by Independent Institute over the years, and my husband and I are very grateful for all the work of the scholars and the Institute, so thank you. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about why we wrote the book, Justice on Trial. I have a co-author, Carrie Severino, who is not here, and typically we're talking about it together, but she was my full partner in the whole process, and she is the head of the Judicial Crisis Network, which advocates for judges and justices getting confirmed. And she and I had worked together during the Kavanaugh confirmation process, similar to what I was just saying. I was covering the story. I was talking about it on television. She was highly informed. We knew each other a little bit before then, but we got to know each other quite a bit more by going through the Kavanaugh confirmation process. And we knew that there was a really interesting story to be told, that this is something that had gripped the nation. It had definitely affected both of us quite personally. And we wanted to tell the story and get the facts out. My co-author, Carrie, clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas. And one of the things that really affected her was knowing a little bit about that story, how Clarence Thomas went through a confirmation hearing that was in some ways very similar to the one that Brett Kavanaugh went through. He made it through his hearings, and after the hearings were done, then an allegation came out, leaked through the media, and there were just really brutal hearings, reopened hearings that he had to go through. And after those hearings, if you polled, and they did, Americans by a 2-to-1 margin believed Clarence Thomas over Anita Hill. At the time, people remembered that her story, she had an allegation, she did not have evidence in support of the allegation. There were a lot of problems with the story that people remembered at the time. But after decades of sort of a rewriting of history, including television shows and movies and books that kind of recrafted the narrative, you might not see those same large margins of Americans believing Clarence Thomas over his accuser. And after the Kavanaugh confirmation, I think a lot of people did breathe a sigh of relief that allegations that had no evidence in support of them could not derail a nomination, that he was confirmed. But it's also important for people to remember that that's just the first part of a long battle, and what's important for people as they are thinking through these issues is to base their understanding of the story on facts. And so that's why Carrie and I wanted to get the story down immediately from people who had lived through the process and while the facts were available. And as was mentioned, we interviewed more than 100 people, which was incredibly time-consuming but very worthwhile. And we thought we knew a lot about the story when we started writing the book, and after interviewing more than 100 people, and in some cases that was interviewing one person, one of those numbers counts as one person being interviewed 3, 4, 5 times, sometimes for as many as 10, 12 hours. It was really important for us to get the facts right. You'd learn something, go back to the person and ask more. We had no idea how much we didn't know about what was going on behind the scenes. And it is sometimes important that people learn not just from failures, but from successes. And so this was a success for the people who wanted Kavanaugh confirmed, and there were a lot of reasons why it was successful. And it's important to learn from those so that future confirmation battles can be informed by that process. But I wanted to tell just 4 of the stories that we get into in Justice on Trial. And there are a lot of stories in there, and they were fun to write. But I wanted to just highlight 4 different individuals that we learned about through our reporting and what we learned from them. So the first is Ashley Kavanaugh, and this is the wife of Brett Kavanaugh. She's someone who was born in Texas. She worked for George W. Bush when he was governor of Texas, and then came with him, went on the campaign when he first ran for president, and came with him and ends up working for him as his personal secretary at the White House. That's how she meets Brett Kavanaugh, who is someone who they think they met each other the first day that they were there, but they didn't start dating until September 10th, 2001. And the next day was momentous for both of them. He recalls watching her run down Executive Avenue, which is the street right outside the White House, as they fled the White House. She had a lot of close contact with the Bush family, admired them, loved them. When she and Brett Kavanaugh get married, the Bushes actually host a rehearsal dinner for them on the lawn of the White House. She ends up leaving the White House to when they start their family, but goes on to work at the Bush Library for many years. So this is someone who's very close to that family. She ends up praying that when he's being talked about as a potential nominee for the Supreme Court, she prays that he will not get the nomination, because she had already gone through 2 brutal confirmation battles prior to this. He'd been nominated twice for his federal judgeship, and he had to be nominated twice because actually court battles have been quite contentious for decades. And there was so much going on during the Bush administration of people trying to stop Bush nominees, which we get into in the book. But so he'd gone through brutal confirmation hearings, and he had a lifetime appointment as a federal judge. They had a great life, and she thought, wouldn't it be great if we could just keep having this great life and not have to go through anything brutal? I don't think she had any idea how brutal it might get. And just as an example of things that I hadn't really thought about prior to writing the book, one of the things I didn't realize which is obvious to me now, that there's a primary when you're a potential person to be a Supreme Court nominee. There's basically a primary that's run completely behind the scenes. Your clerks and your people who love you are all advocating for you with anyone who might have any sway in the White House, and it's this huge contentious battle. The clerks who worked for Judge Kavanaugh, now Justice Kavanaugh, said that as crazy as things got in the eventual confirmation hearing, they still felt the primary period was the roughest period. They were working so hard and, trying to counter any negative information that was coming out. Different people advocate for different judges, and so they were working very hard. But there's also a lot of observation of shortlisted candidates for the Supreme Court. So you will have major media camped out on your lawn if there's even a hint you might be the nominee. And Brett Kavanaugh lived in Washington, D.C. He grew up in Washington, D.C. Most of the other candidates were far afield from Washington, D.C. or New York. So it's very easy for every media outlet in the country to be camped out on Brett Kavanaugh's lawn. But what that meant is that the family had to vacate the premises prior to any announcement being made, regardless of what the announcement would be, which is a little weird when you're just living there and you have kids and whatnot. So the White House let the Kavanaughs know they needed to leave the place, because whether Brett Kavanaugh was going to be the nominee or not, you could probably tell by observing the family. In other words, if the family has sat down for dinner on the night that the announcement is supposed to be made, well, you can get a good feeling that it's not going to be Brett Kavanaugh. So they wanted them just vacated from the house. And they end up having to escape the house also without the media noticing, because if you're seen leaving, well, then that also might give a sign. So they escape through a hatch door in their backyard, tunneling through. They throw their luggage into a treehouse of a neighbor. A neighbor kid then later retrieves the luggage and brings it to them. They're changing cars and whatnot, but just all these things that you don't even think about having to do. And that's before things get bad. One thing that had prepared Ashley Kavanaugh was working in the White House during 9/11 and the difficult days after that. She developed some habits like finding Bible verses to meditate on, writing them on a Post-it note and putting them for her to see regularly. And this ends up being something that helps her throughout the process. When things break down and get rough, people are calling her and trying to offer her support, or her friends are giving her kind words or whatnot. But many of them told us that she was the one who was helping them, that she would give them scripture verses, or she would give them nice thoughts. And I think that kind of came through also in the eventual hearing, the reopened hearing, where Brett Kavanaugh talks about his wife praying with his daughter, Liza, and she says, I think we should pray for the woman who has made this accusation. That indicates something about what's going on in the family, I think. So we enjoyed learning more about her and being able to tell that story. The second person I wanted to highlight that we got to cover in Justice on Trial is Rachael Mitchell. Rachael Mitchell was the sex crimes prosecutor who Republicans hired to interview Christine Blasey Ford. And I think a lot of people felt disappointed by her, or that was kind of the indication that people said right after the hearing. And in our reporting, we learned what a central and important figure she was. So what happens is they get through the first round of hearings, which, by the way, were completely chaotic. People think things got crazy only when allegations were made, but in fact, they'd been crazy from the very beginning. You had senators saying before anyone was nominated that they would vote against whoever the nominee was. Within minutes of Brett Kavanaugh being named, there was a protest that had been pre-planned at the Supreme Court. They kind of knew it was going to be one of 4 candidates, so they discarded the signs against the other 3 candidates, and they shipped out the ones for Brett Kavanaugh. And there was a large protest featuring all of the senators who would later run for president, and a coalition of leftist groups who, throughout the summer, worked together to pay protesters to come out to D.C., gave them matching outfits, those don't sew themselves, and trained them how to disrupt hearings, which they did, trained them how to get arrested and paid for their bail. And this was happening in the first round of hearings. It was already really crazy. After everything's done and Brett Kavanaugh's on track to be nominated, that's when the rollout of this allegation starts. And almost immediately, you have a situation on the Senate Judiciary Committee where Republicans held that committee, but only by 1 vote. So every vote mattered because all of the Democrats, except for 1, had already announced that they were going to vote against him. And so you needed every single Republican to vote to send Brett Kavanaugh out of the committee in order to be voted on by the entire Senate. And when the allegations come out, Mitch McConnell and Chairman Grassley of the committee did not think that the accusations necessarily rose to the level that you would stop everything and hold a hearing. They were open to hearing evidence in support of the allegation, but hadn't gotten any at that point and never would. So they weren't necessarily inclined to hold a hearing on the theory that if you can stop a process by making an allegation without evidence, that could really be a bad precedent to set. But there were several Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee who insisted immediately that a hearing be held. And because every vote was needed, and that I just want to make a point, it's several. A lot of people think just Jeff Flake was a problem on that committee for getting the nomination through. But in fact, it was several senators, a lot, who wanted a hearing held. And then becomes an issue of people who remember their history or not. I referenced the Clarence Thomas hearings where any question posed to Anita Hill about her allegation was interpreted by the media as being an attack on a victim. And so knowing that the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was all the Republicans on it, are male, some of them are not the best questioners. And so then it became a concern of, is this going to look good if we're asking questions of someone who the media will portray as someone you can't ask questions of? So pretty quickly they decide we want to hire a prosecutor who can ask the questions. And that was challenging because a lot of firms wouldn't allow their partners to be in this role. So you might have a partner who is willing to do it, but the firm wouldn't allow her, or other people who for other reasons didn't want to do it. And someone recommends Rachael Mitchell. She's actually the nation's foremost expert in how to interview sex crime victims. So she gives lessons on this to people, how to interview people who, may very well be victims of horrific crimes, children, women, and others who are vulnerable. And when they interview her about the job, she lets them know, if you're looking for a pit bull, that's not me. I have a job to get back to. I'm not interested in being rude or mean to anyone who may be a victim of a crime here. Only the day before does she learn that her questioning will have to be done in 5-minute increments. Now, her expertise is in forensic interviews where to find out if someone is a victim of a crime and whether you can prosecute that, you want to ask them questions fully. You want to have them tell the story in a free environment. Then you want to kind of ask them to tell it backwards or, come at it different ways. So you can kind of determine how solid their story is. And in this case, it had to be done in 5-minute increments, which is barely enough time to build rapport, to get anything. But she actually manages to do quite a bit that is influential for the senators. Just by way of example, the hearing and the vote on Kavanaugh had to be delayed because Christine Blasey Ford's attorneys told the Senate that she was terrified of flying. This is something that the media reported uncritically. So one of the lines of questioning she had was just about that issue. How did you get here? I flew. How did you get out here when you were here earlier this summer? I flew. She asked some questions about something on Dr. Ford's resume that says she worked for an Australian company. And she said, I could never fly to Australia. And then she said, it says on your resume that you have a hobby of international surf travel. It's very difficult to do that hobby without flying over large expanses of ocean. So just kind of seeing maybe this story wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. She later briefs the senators, some of whom have no idea how they're going to vote, on what she found. And she said, not only is there not enough to get a search warrant on Brett Kavanaugh, or not only is there not enough to get a conviction on Brett Kavanaugh, there's not enough to get a search warrant. And when they realize that, they have a problem voting against him if there's not even evidence in support of it. Okay. Another person whose story we tell in the book is Leland Keyser. Leland Keyser is the lifelong female friend of Christine Blasey Ford, who was alleged to have been at the party in question where the assault was supposed to have taken place. The other witnesses that were named by Dr. Ford as having been at that party all denied any knowledge of it or having had any memory of it. Leland Keyser also said she had no memory of it. But what was interesting was what happened after she publicly said she had no memory of it. She was really trying hard to support her friend, who was a lifelong friend. She did not want Brett Kavanaugh on the court. She's a liberal, actually had been married to Bob Beckel and had 2 kids with him. He's a Democratic strategist. And she really, not just, and it wasn't that the politics mattered, she just wanted to support her friend, who she very much, had grown up with and enjoyed and liked. And she was trying to piece together something that could support the story. And there's eventually a reopened FBI investigation. That's what the Senate Judiciary Committee ends up doing, is voting Brett Kavanaugh out of committee in exchange for an additional week of FBI investigation. And at that time, too, Leland Keyser is getting pressure from mutual friends of hers and Christine Blasey Ford's. They say, come on, you're perjuring yourself. You had to have known that this, she said she never met Brett Kavanaugh, and they're like, you had to have known him. And she's like, I didn't. But she's getting pressure. And when she goes in and talks to the FBI again, our reporting indicates that that was something that was conveyed to the FBI, that she had been pressured by mutual friends. But more than that she'd had some time to work on her memory of what had happened that summer. And she remembered the summer quite well. It was a very important summer for her. It's when she started playing golf, which went on to be what her life's work was. And she remembered all sorts of things about that summer. And she began to lose confidence in her friend's story, claiming that she was there. And that is also told to the FBI. And senators found that extremely important information as they made their decision. And then finally, another person who we tell her story is, and it really does just happen to be that these are 4 women because there are men's stories in here too, but Senator Susan Collins, who ends up being a very central person in the story. She actually gets targeted by leftist groups before Kavanaugh is even named. Leftist groups are sending threatening packages to her offices in Maine of hangers as a signal that her vote needs to be against the nominee. And that continues throughout the summer. She's the last person you should bully because she just doesn't take it very well. It made her even more resolved to be very thorough in her investigation of Brett Kavanaugh. She is not on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And the way committees work is that if you're on the committee, you put a lot of work into it, but if you're off the committee, you just kind of trust the committee to do their work. Not Susan Collins. She hires her own team of attorneys to go through all of his cases, speeches. She knows his work so well that she ends up realizing she knows more about it than a lot of the people she's talking to. So they would say, well, aren't you worried about what he said in this speech? And she would say, but if you look at footnote 4, it says quite clearly that he doesn't want you to take that interpretation. I mean, she knew his work so well that it was probably better than anyone on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And she prepared for the interview with him. Nominees meet with most senators on their way to their hearings, and she had a very lengthy interview with him, longer than most people, because the White House knew that it was important to get her vote, and it went well. And as they're leaving, they're just thinking, we did a great job with this interview. And she says, oh, but maybe we could meet again. And the White House is like, no, we got out of this. Like, we did it. We're golden. And Brett Kavanaugh was like, well, that would be lovely. So they're like, oh, no. But that ends up being providential, too, because their time of meeting again was right when these allegations broke. So she was able to talk to him and hear what he had to say about them, and that was very important. She ends up voting for him, but that's not even what's key, although it is key, because the Senate majority was so slim that every vote counted there too. She gives a speech on the importance of rule of law, presumption of innocence, things that all people, all Americans should care about deeply. And that is so important. She could have just lodged her vote and laid low, and instead she took it on quite dramatically, and I think it's really admirable. So the book is called Justice on Trial, the Kavanaugh Confirmation, and the Future of the Supreme Court. And we do also talk a little bit about what the Kavanaugh confirmation process means for the future. One of our concerns is that if things like this are allowed to happen, and if they happen regularly, it'll affect the talent pool for nominations. There are a lot of people who quite reasonably would say, even if they're willing to go through something as horrible as being accused of being a serial gang rapist, that they might not want to put their family or children or young children through that kind of process. And I frankly think that's part of the goal of some of these brutal confirmation processes. We are concerned that for the health of the process, no matter who is nominating, that people be held accountable for bad action. And that means that when you make false allegations, you should be held accountable. Reputation is a real thing, and harm to reputation is a real harm. There were some people who were referred for criminal prosecution for making false allegations, but to our knowledge, definitely nobody has been held accountable yet, but I'm not even sure if any action has been taken by the Department of Justice on that. The Senate has procedures for how to handle serious allegations, such as the ones that were made against Brett Kavanaugh, and senators on the Senate Judiciary Committee circumvented that process and also were not held accountable for that. It's important that people protect people who are being accused and also protect victims who are making an accusation. Senator Cory Spartacus Booker violated procedures on how to handle committee confidential information, which is really important because some White Houses might not feel comfortable handing over information to committees if they don't feel it'll be protected, and that can hurt the process of the advise and consent process. Also, the media behaved really horribly in this, immediately taking sides and being very one-sided in how they approached this very complicated and difficult topic. And not only was nobody fired or reprimanded, they basically gave each other awards or promotions and whatnot. And that's not good for the health of the country. So we're concerned about some of these things. And ultimately, though, we think that the legitimacy of the court itself rests on the court understanding its proper role. So as the court gets more political, it's not unreasonable that confirmation battles are political. And recent decades have had far too many political decisions where justices decided that they would like the law to be different than it is. And so they invent new rights, or they redefine legislation, or they have like really difficult to defend interpretations of federal statutes. And that does a lot to harm the legitimacy of the court and it incentivizes a very political process. So that's what I have to say for this, but I'm happy to take questions to talk about it further.
Senator Feinstein?
So we do not talk about who we interviewed unless it is made explicitly clear that they're fine with that. Most of our interviews were conducted on background, which means you can use the information, but not who gave you the information. But we did interview many senators, and we learned a lot. Actually, one of the things that's interesting in the book is about Senator Feinstein. First of all, both of your senators, and may I compliment you on your senators, play an active role in the book. I was somewhat surprised to learn what a great reputation Dianne Feinstein had with her peers on the Senate Judiciary Committee, but how that was really harmed in this process. So over and over, senators would tell us, they'd be like, I really like her, and I didn't like how she handled this. And there is a scene that we describe in the book that is the day after the reopened hearings. So the Senate Judiciary Committee is preparing to vote Kavanaugh out of committee. But what ends up happening is a complete and utter breakdown. This was the day when Jeff Flake announces he's going to vote for Kavanaugh, then he gets harangued in the elevator, and then he comes in, and then there's just chaos. Everybody clears the committee room, and they go to this private room called an anteroom. And we spoke with people who said it was the craziest scene they'd ever seen in the Senate, that senators were literally almost coming to blows in that room. And the thing that they were upset about was Dianne Feinstein, actually. They felt that her staff had exploited, like they still got along well with her, but they felt her staff was doing things against her explicit requests, and that she was not cracking down on them as much as they should. So that ends up being a really big problem, but a lot of people thought they couldn't recover from it in the future. You know, ranking member of a committee is very important. She represents all the Democrats on the committee, and you need to have good working relationship, and a lot of people felt it was irreparably harmed.
In today's environment, if you were Don McGahn's successor as White House counsel, can you imagine recommending to the president that he nominate a male to go on the Supreme Court?
Okay, so I do actually think that it would be difficult for activists to run the exact same game plan right after this one failed, because I think what happened with the Kavanaugh situation is when the first allegation comes out, people say they're willing to listen to it. What's the evidence in support of it? You know, that they might have never gotten the evidence, but they were willing to hear it, and it was at least within the realm of possible. And after the delays and whatnot, you start getting these allegations that are just increasingly absurd, of a nationwide crime spree where this federal judge who'd gone through 6 background checks was apparently just a roving criminal, you know, who led an underage gang rape cartel in the suburbs of Maryland. Like, when those are the allegations, people start going, wait a minute, I see what's going on here. This isn't real. Like, this is just a campaign. So if you were to do another one immediately on the heels of that, I think it would be difficult to sustain. By the way, one of our sources said that, I forget exactly how many it was. I think it was 3 or 4 people he credited with the Kavanaugh confirmation going through. It was President Trump, Don McGahn, who's a very important figure in this. I think there was another one, but he said Michael Avenatti. So, another great Californian.
I'm really concerned about allegations that are made and then found to be false and then just left there. It seems like that's kind of the way our society and political arena is going, and I'm very concerned about what that means for the future. Could you comment on that, please?
Yes, I think that was one of the things I found most interesting, and I actually wrote a piece about this at the Federalist about how all of those investigations of Kavanaugh just kind of went away the moment he was confirmed, which doesn't really make sense, because if it's bad that someone who might be on the Supreme Court had done these things, wouldn't it be much worse if the person is on the Supreme Court? Wouldn't that make you even more committed to uncovering these abuses? And the fact that so many people in the media didn't spend any time, I thought was very telling. I was speaking with someone earlier this week who said it reminded them of O.J. Simpson saying, I'm going to find the real killer, you know, as soon as I'm and then he just kind of doesn't. And our media behaved like O.J. Simpson. Another great Californian. But having said that, it's also true that I do think there will be a continued campaign. So if you follow what happened with Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, there was this decades-long attempt to make sure that her allegations were treated as very credible and beyond dispute, even though that wasn't the case at the time. And there are multiple books coming out that will definitely be trying to relitigate this in a way that is supportive of that accuser or other accusers. And so I think you should expect those things. And even in the last year, Time magazine named Christine Blasey Ford one of the 100 most important Americans, and Sports Illustrated had her interviews. I forget the name of the gymnast who actually made it known that the coach or the doctor in Michigan had been abusing all the kids. It's like a really horrible story of sex crimes, and they had Blasey Ford interview her as if her story had been credible, even though it didn't have evidence in support of it, and certainly didn't lead to a conviction.
Can I ask you a question that you can't answer?
Yes.
But please answer it anyway. I came tonight because it was you. Had it been Hannity or Tucker Carlson, I would not have come. And the reason is that those two guys are always yelling at me. And you don't do that. And they're condescending. And you don't do that. You answer the question quietly, diplomatically, strongly. My question is, are you going to get your own show? Because I think you are better than those people.
You are very kind to say.
No, I'm just very honest.
I prefer to write. That's my preferred mode of communication, and I am kind of surprised to find myself on TV because it's not what is my natural skill set. But I have learned by being on TV that it really is a challenge to host a show or to do. I mean, it's so much you're having to think about at all times to manage that, and I am very impressed by people who do it, and I hope that I never am in a position to to have to do that. But yeah.
So I wind up doing these independent investigations in the workplace, and I wind up doing second opinions on other people's investigations. And we're living in an era now, thanks to the Me Too movement, where people are guilty, and trying to prove them innocent is exceedingly difficult. And I'm constantly fighting for innocent until guilty and trying to prove it. But I think that, God, I don't know why I can't pronounce her name. She's teaching at the school that I got my doctorate at, so it's like very offensive. But it's almost impossible in today's climate to say somebody's innocent and to actually take them on and try to find the truth. So I think she's going to get away with it. I think she's going to make a lot of money on it. I don't know if she's written a book yet, but I'm sure that will happen. And it happens in the workplace all the time now.
Well, that's actually what I was so concerned about with writing the book was, yes, what happened to Brett Kavanaugh was very difficult for a lot of people to watch, but seeing so many people not care about rule of law, presumption of innocence, that was horrifying and terrifying.
So if you go back to the 80s and the whole child abuse movement, children don't lie, and if they do, they don't lie about this. All you had to do back then was go through a divorce and want to off your husband, basically. And so you said he molested your child, and there's no evidence whatsoever. It's the same kind of mentality that's going on.
It's not even about false accusations. I mean, sometimes people have gone through traumatic experiences, and they misinterpret those, or they have false memories. That's actually quite common. We interviewed memory experts for the book as well, and they said that the thing that really bothered them about the reopened hearing was when something was said about something being indelible in the hippocampus, and everyone in the media said, oh, you can't doubt that. It was indelible in the hippocampus. And the memory expert said literally nothing about memory is indelible. It's one of the most malleable things in the brain, and the brain itself is just such a mysterious organ and whatnot. So you don't even need to impugn bad motivation to know that people might, even in good faith, have a false accusation, which is why we care so much and have for thousands of years. This predates the American founding, this understanding that people are innocent until proven guilty and how important that is. But some people say if it's not in a court of law, it doesn't matter. And I'm so glad to hear you say that you care about it in your work life, because it matters in all of our lives, I think.
Hi. Given that President Trump is reelected as president and the Senate maintains a majority, there are two outstanding jurors that look like likely replacements for Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer, the Clinton appointees. What do you think of these two nominees? One would be Amy Coney Barrett of Indiana and Tom Hardiman of Pennsylvania.
So those are two of the judges that we write about in the book, in part because they were on the short list for the Kennedy seat, which becomes the Kavanaugh seat, and Hardiman actually for both the Gorsuch and the Kennedy, or the Kavanaugh seats. And we get into why Kavanaugh was chosen and why they weren't. But one of the things that was interesting is how close it was. They were all viewed as very good nominees with different strengths and whatnot. In the case of Amy Coney Barrett, what's interesting about that situation is she'd only been a judge for a few months. And everyone seems to think that she will be a very good judge. And she's now been on her bench for like a year and a half, or close to 2 years. And she definitely seems like she is a really good and interesting judge. But at the time of that first opening, she'd only been on for a few months. And one of the things we look at in the book is how Supreme Court seats, how Republican presidents had failed to do a good job with their nominations, going back to Eisenhower, actually, and how that ends up being why Donald Trump puts together his list of potential nominees. So there are all sorts of mistakes people made, including nominating people who didn't really have much of a record on the theory that they would be good, and then finding out, David Souter, that they would not be so good. And so there are all different sorts of errors that people made, and the Trump list is designed to avoid those types of errors. So they're looking for people who are originalists, who really care deeply about originalism and love of Constitution, that they have a record that shows they've been able to do that on the bench. It's not just a record outside of the, so there are people who write well about it, but there's something about actually signing your name to a decision that shows that you have the courage of your conviction. And then just also looking for people who do have courage in general, that they won't be swayed by pressure from the media or the left or whatnot. So that list comes out early in 2016, and we get into it quite a bit, actually. It just like blows a lot of Republicans away, because they had this theory that Donald Trump would nominate like his crazy liberal sister to the court, and instead he's putting out a list of people, and they're all really good names. And so even the other potential nominees for the Republican nomination, they're like, that's a good list. I have nothing to say about it. Like, that's what my list would be, And it also enables Don McGahn and his team to continually vet people, not just for the Supreme Court, but for other lower court positions. And so a lot of presidents, Republican and Democrat, they kind of get blindsided by openings on the Supreme Court. And in both of their cases, they were very well prepared. Obviously, in one case, because they'd been planning since Anna Scalia died, but also for the other one, they're just working on it constantly, vetting people, learning more about their record, thinking about who would be good for which type of seat and whatnot. And it really, I think you'll probably see a lot more of this type of behavior, at least from Republican nominees, because Republican voters had lost confidence in candidates that they would actually do a good job with Supreme Court nominations. And it was that list and sticking to that list that helped Republican voters trust Donald Trump. 20 or 25%, I can't remember, of Trump voters say the Supreme Court was why they voted for him.
On the assumption that the Republicans held the Senate and Trump was reelected, what is your guess? Will Ruth Bader Ginsburg die on the bench, or would she? No, I'm serious. That she'd go till the game is over, because it's been over for her for a while. I mean, I watched her on the Supreme Court. She has some trouble staying away.
I personally think she'll outlive us all. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just.
Okay, but she's not going to resign, right?
I don't think so. She's actually spoken a little bit about it, that if she needed to resign, she would. She doesn't, if she were to lose her faculties or whatnot. And certainly one thing that's interesting is that at Brett Kavanaugh's investiture, she fell like right before that, and she wasn't there, and then she had she had some medical issue that kept her off from hearing cases for a couple months, and a lot of people thought that's going to be it. But I would not count on it, so I don't know. But if I would say that there are a bunch of people who are at least in the actuary tables of maybe, there's a risk there. But of course, anything can happen that's a surprise, any of the.
Hi, Molly.
Hello.
I'm studying to be a public school teacher here in California. So I want to say first, like when I watch you and hear you and read you, I really appreciate how you do point out, because you don't hear it very often, but you point out the trend sort of rewriting history with some of these things, and I imagine that's probably going to happen more and more. So I appreciate that. Thank you. But also, I wanted to ask you, what, I guess, as a teacher, like I'm in California here, and which says something. How do you have any advice for just educators and how to approach these types of things with what's really going to be important for kids who are going to become adults to know?
Yes. So first off, thank you, and thank you for working toward teaching. And my mother is a retired public school teacher, and I've thought about these issues through what she went through. In recent days, the New York Times has put out a rewriting history kind of project called the 1619 Project, which wants people to reimagine the true meaning of the founding from one based on our founding documents, which were written at a time when there was a lot of injustice, but provided the keys to removing that injustice, to one that just basically says those documents themselves are flawed and sinful and can't be, they basically need to be gotten rid of. So not hard to see what the goal is there, getting rid of the Constitution, the Electoral College, the Senate, all these things that have been used to preserve liberty and keep us from being just like mob rule. So I think it's just the reason why a project like that can take root is because people have not done a good job of teaching the principles of the American founding and why they're important. And so the most wonderful thing you can do is teach those, and kids really do want to learn these things. And when they find out about them and learn that what they were taught was false, they get angry because they feel they've been like brainwashed, basically, or something like that. But one good teacher can do so much good work, and I'm so thankful for my good teachers who inculcated in me a love of these important things.
Could you share your perception of how the Fords of the world and the girls from Ivani's group, how they get motivated by the organizers or financiers, how they get selected, how that comes about as the opposition tries to roll out these campaigns?
So Carrie and I are very careful not to in any way speculate on motivation where we don't have facts. And so I have a lot of theories, but I'm very reticent to go into them other than what the facts are. I do find some things very interesting, like that when the letter gets to Dianne Feinstein, and she has a procedure she could use that's well established, that was put in place after the Thomas hearings, she goes out of her way to avoid that process. And instead of putting that letter in through the background checking process where the FBI can look into these things, she gives it to a high-profile attorney who is known for rolling out public relations campaigns, that rather than doing a forensic interview, which would be the first thing you do if you're trying to ascertain validity, they do a polygraph, which is kind of a, and then what they give the polygrapher in terms of a statement is very nebulous and weird. And there's like clearly an orchestrated rollout. That's a weird thing to do. And I don't know why. Or we learned things like Christine Blasey Ford was adamant that her story be kept confidential. And that was a big part of why people said they did things the way they did, which doesn't make sense because of what I just said. There was a confidential process and it was avoided. But also that her first phone call is to the Washington Post, which is not normally something that you do, or that, she's a well-educated PhD professor who says she didn't know how to contact a senator. These are things that just, I mean, that's kind of far afield from what you're saying, but we do look at the coordination, and I do think that is one of the downsides of having lists out, is that you can figure out your line of attack on everybody years in advance. Democrats are working on their list of potential nominees, but they're keeping it secret, partly because they know that if people knew who they would nominate, it would make them look extreme, and partly because I don't think they want to give people on the other side a chance to research those people.
I'd like to ask something about the future of the Supreme Court, because Senator Whitehouse has a new bill to try to get the court packed, and I wondered whether you think that has any chance of success.
So that's what I wrote about in the San Francisco Chronicle today, was about this court packing strategy. And I'm not sure if he has he started the bill? I know he's talking about it, and he and 4 other Democratic senators did an amicus brief on a case where they said, you better rule the way we want, or we might do some court packing. And that is something that is, the Constitution does not fix the number of justices, so it's a fine thing to argue that it should be different. But in this case, it's clear that it's being done for political control. And FDR did this when his New Deal was ruled unconstitutional. Various provisions were ruled unconstitutional. He came up with legislation that would give him 6 new justices. And that didn't go through, but it still had a desired effect of pressuring the court. You had legislation that did go through, giving full pensions to Supreme Court members who retired. So 4 of them left that way. 2 more died in the next few years. And one justice who stayed on the court, some people believe he started ruling differently in response to the pressure. So you need to be careful about these pressure campaigns. As oddly enough, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said recently in an NPR interview about how it's not even close to, it's obviously a political ploy to pressure the court. You want an independent judiciary that is not swayed by politics. And unfortunately, one of the fun things about the book was getting to interview some Supreme Court justices, and there are some who believe, that even that's something that has afflicted the court, including some Republican nominees, is political pressure. And so it's very important to stand against it. I think in the case of this White House amicus brief, it was so gross, it was so over the top that it might backfire. It might be the kind of thing that even the liberal justices are like, oh, that didn't look good. Now it'll look like we're just, ruling one way out of political pressure. So it's important that people stand strong against it. Also, there are people, including a potential Democratic nominee, who want to term limit justices. And that's obviously in violation of the Constitution. But more than that, it's just really important that people know that they serve for life and that they not be, again, beholden to some of these pressures.
When the Christine Blasey Ford story broke, I believe people found that she had virtually no social media presence on Facebook or Twitter or anything. And then I've read some rumors that it may be that she scrubbed it because she had posted partisan leftist things on there. Did you uncover anything about that?
We did. So one of the things that was interesting about the book is that it's a national story, but also Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh grew up in D.C. or the suburbs right outside D.C. So a lot of the people that we were interviewing who knew them still live there and whatnot. And we interviewed quite a few people who know her and not even necessarily have a huge problem with her or anything. They said that her Facebook page was crazy liberal, that it was, which I think by Facebook standards, that must mean really something. But that it was, we get into this, but it professionally scrubbed right before the nomination. So, or at that time. So that's certainly interesting. And I think a media that was better at thinking through stories might have thought that was more significant than they let it on to be. They wanted to create a story of her not being very political, and that was at odds with what her friends told us.
Don't you think we've got to the point where there is no presumption of innocence for white males? And only racism can be practiced by white males, or sexism. And I really think that there is a presumption of guilt, and that It's not good.
Yeah, well, I think that is something very much to be concerned about. We look at what was happening in the media environment when the allegations came out against Brett Kavanaugh, and some of the pieces that were written in supposedly respectable journals were something along the lines of, well, I was once assaulted by a prep school kid, so Brett Kavanaugh's guilty. It's like, that doesn't make any sense at all. And you would never tolerate that about a different socioeconomic group. You would never see people tolerating that kind of, just false thinking about other groups. It is, it's scary, and it's just, again, not good for the country. It is, the whole country has fallen into identity politics, and the one group that used to sort of not be totally into that would be, white people were given the option of voting left or right. There wasn't pressure that they had to be one way or the other. But as identity politics has controlled so much, I think it creates more identity-based thinking, which I believe is contrary to what has made our country great and not a good path for overcoming racial injustice or other things. But it's also just strategically unwise of the left, I think, to go into identity politics, because they were always so adamant that the demography will change the election results, and they sort of forgot that the country still has a large white contingent. And if you make them be an identity block that vote in block, that might not be the best strategy for winning national elections. But it is just important for people to take allegations seriously, and part of taking them seriously does actually mean requiring evidence in support of them. And I do think that apart from the hysteria that we saw, a lot of people still get that, and it did horrify them to see what could happen to someone without evidence in support of it, and they could easily put themselves into that scenario, or they could see their sons or brothers or uncles or whatever being in such a scenario. And we look at how it affected 2018 elections, which were like a huge, huge victory for Democrats in many ways. But in some of the Senate races that they lost, and they ended up losing Senate seats, the people who lost, the candidates who lost, believe they lost in part because of the overreach of Democrats on this situation. So not time to give up hope yet that people care about these things.
Thanks for being here. You got incredibly close to this story. And I would certainly respect you if you don't want to answer this question. But I'll bet you have an opinion on what happened at the party. What might it be?
So actually, I don't...
If there was a party.
That's what I would say. There was never any evidence in support of the party. You had the word of one person. All four witnesses who were supposedly there said it wasn't there. There was not only no, there were, again, we talked to the friends of Christine Blasey Ford's, and for them, what really struck them was her not knowing how she got home, and not knowing anything about Leland, the friend that she ostensibly left at the party. And men might not get this, but it would be really weird for a girl to have been a victim and leave a friend and not talk about it. And so, not saying that weird things don't happen, but there were so many weird things, not knowing where it was, not knowing how she got there, not knowing how she left there, not knowing, just a lot of problem. Thank you very much.
I want to really thank Mollie and also her co-author, Carrie, who couldn't be here, for the really incredibly great work. This was true investigative journalism, and I think holds a standard for many other people, not just in the media, but the general public. So let's give Mollie another round of applause. And as far as you're joining with us, I want to thank you all for making this such a wonderful and successful event. So thank you.